There are nights when a man thinks his life has already reached its darkest point. But what if a single injured dog on a snowy road could lead him toward a truth that had been waiting for years? What if the path he feared most carried the key to a new home, a new family, and a purpose he thought he had lost forever? Tonight, you will follow the journey of Mark and Buddy, from cold loneliness to healing hope and the miracle hidden in the mountains of Colorado. I hope you enjoy this story. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments below and subscribe. Snow covered the quiet streets of Colorado in a thick white layer as a cold wind pushed through the narrow roads and wrapped the whole town in a deep winter silence. The night felt heavy and sharp, and the air stung against the skin with every breath. Under a flickering street lamp walked Mark Collins, who moved with slow, tired steps after a long shift. Mark was a 40-year-old American veteran with a tall frame shaped by his years in service. His shoulders were broad, but his body had grown thin from long hours of physical work and too many skipped meals. His short brown hair carried faint strands of gray, and his face showed the rugged angles of a man who had lived through hardship. He wore a brown-yellow jacket that had faded with time and a pair of worn blue jeans that had followed him through many rough seasons. His boots were old and heavy, and each step sank slightly into the soft snow. Life after leaving the military had not been kind to Mark. He worked the night shift at a warehouse where he lifted crates until his arms burned and his back felt tight. The pay was barely enough to cover the rent of a cheap room above an old building near the town center. The room was small, with peeling paint and a heater that worked only sometimes. Bills piled up faster than he could pay them, and the weight of debt followed him every day like a shadow he could not outrun. Still, he worked without complaint. He carried the discipline of a soldier and the silence of someone who had seen more than he wished to remember. On this night, the fatigue in his body was stronger than usual. 12 hours of lifting heavy cargo had drained every part of him. The cold wind stung his face and wrapped around him as he walked toward his room. He lowered his head against the gusts of snow and let the crunch of his boots fill the quiet street. He felt the ache in his muscles and the dull pressure behind his eyes, but he kept moving forward through the empty night. Then something on the side of the road caught his attention. A dark shape lay near the edge of the pavement, partly covered by snow. At first, it looked like debris left behind by a passing vehicle, but something about it made him slow his steps. He stopped under the dim street lamp and looked closer. The shape moved just slightly, and Mark felt a familiar instinct rise inside him, the instinct to check on something that might be hurt. He walked toward the shape and knelt down. Under the thin layer of snow lay a German shepherd with a thick black and tan coat now matted with blood and ice. The dog looked young, but its body was shaking from pain and cold. One of its legs was twisted at an uncomfortable angle, and a deep cut near its paw dripped slowly into the snow. Its breathing was weak and shallow, as though each breath cost more strength than it had left. Mark looked up and down the road and saw the faint mark of tires cutting across the snow. Someone had hit the dog and left it there. He felt a quiet heaviness in his chest. He had seen enough harm in his life to recognize suffering when it was in front of him. The dog opened its eyes and looked at him with a mix of fear and exhaustion. In that brief moment, he saw a plea in the dog's gaze. It was the look of a creature left alone in the cold, with no one else to turn to. Mark knew he had very little. He knew he struggled to pay rent and buy food for himself. He knew he had no money for a vet, but he also knew he could not leave the dog in the snow to fade away. The cold wind pressed against him as he gently slid his arms under the dog. The dog whimpered softly, but did not resist. Mark lifted it with care, even though the weight made his tired muscles tremble. He stood and carried the dog through the falling snow, step by slow step, until he reached the narrow staircase leading to his rented room. Inside the room, he laid the dog on an old blanket near the weak heater. The dim yellow light revealed the full extent of the injuries. Mark opened his small first aid kit, which he had kept from his days in the military. He cleaned the wound with careful, steady hands and wrapped the injured leg with gauze and bandages. The dog watched him with tired, trusting eyes, even as the pain made its breathing uneven. When he finished, he sat on the floor beside the dog and let out a slow breath. The room felt different now. For years, the silence had been a heavy presence that greeted him every night. Now there was the soft sound of slow breathing on the blanket. The dog moved its head slightly and rested it against his hand with gentle trust. Mark felt a quiet warmth in his chest, a feeling he had almost forgotten. He looked at the dog and spoke in a soft voice that filled the small room. "You will be Buddy," he said calmly. The dog blinked slowly, as though accepting the name. In that simple moment, something changed inside the worn-down room. After years of returning to emptiness, Mark Collins no longer felt completely alone. The snow continued to fall outside, but inside the tiny room, a fragile sense of companionship began to take root. Mark did not know what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time in a long time, he felt the faint presence of hope resting beside him on an old blanket. Morning light crept slowly across the gray sky above the small town in Colorado as the cold air settled against the roofs and streets in a pale stillness. The wind was quieter than the night before, yet the bite of winter could still be felt in every breath. The sun offered little warmth as it rose behind thin clouds and spread a soft, muted glow across the narrow roads and quiet storefronts. The town was waking with slow movements and distant sounds that echoed through the cold morning air. Inside his small rented room, Mark Collins prepared himself for another long day. The room felt cramped with its low ceiling and peeling walls, yet it was the space he returned to every night, because it was the only place he could afford. The old heater hummed weakly in the corner, offering a faint warmth that barely spread across the floor. Near the foot of his simple bed lay Buddy the German Shepherd, resting on an old blanket that Mark had folded to make a spot for him. Buddy had grown stronger each day since Mark brought him home. His coat held a healthier shine now, and though his injured leg still needed time, he walked with more stability than before. Buddy looked up when Mark moved across the room, his warm brown eyes following with quiet devotion. Mark dressed in work clothes that had been washed so many times their colors had softened to pale shades. His jeans were worn thin at the knees, and his work shirt carried faint stains from oil and dust. His body felt heavy with the familiar aches from long shifts, but he forced himself to keep moving. There was no other choice. Each morning, he worked at a small auto repair garage on the edge of town. The garage belonged to a man named Harris, who was in his late 50s with a round face weathered by years of standing near engines and exhaust fumes. Harris was stern but fair, and he rarely spoke unless he had instructions to give. Mark appreciated that quiet nature. He did not want conversations. He only wanted to get through another day. Mark left the room, and Buddy watched him from the floor, ears alert, tail still, and eyes steady. The dog was recovering, but Mark never left him for long. He walked down the narrow stairs and stepped into the cold morning toward the garage. His breath formed pale clouds with every exhale. His hands were rough and cold inside thin gloves that had lost their insulation years ago. When he reached the garage, smell of oil and metal filled the air, and the sound of tools echoed against the concrete walls. Harris gave a short nod in greeting as Mark walked in and handed him a clipboard with a list of tasks. Mark worked quietly through the morning, lifting tires, wiping engines, cleaning tools, and listening to the steady rhythm of the garage. His arms strained with each heavy object he lifted, and his back ached whenever he bent down, yet he pushed through it with the same determination he once carried in the military. Each completed task meant another small step toward paying bills, waiting on his kitchen table. The weight of survival pressed against him every hour of the day, but he never allowed himself to stop. By late afternoon, the fatigue grew deeper. The sound of drills and clanking metal felt louder than usual. Sweat mixed with the dust on his skin and formed a cold layer beneath his shirt as the winter air seeped into the garage. When Harris waved him off for the day, Mark went outside and breathed in the sharp cold air before heading to his second job. As evening approached, he walked toward the warehouse, where he worked the night shift, loading heavy crates and stacking boxes for long hours. His legs felt stiff and his steps slower, yet he moved with the steady pace of someone used to enduring hardship. Inside the warehouse, bright lights hummed overhead and cast long shadows across the rows of pallets and crates. Mark put on his gloves and lifted one heavy box after another. His muscles strained until they burned with the familiar dull fire of exhaustion. Some of his coworkers joked with one another during breaks, but Mark remained quiet. The noise of the warehouse faded into a background hum as his mind drifted back to moments from the battlefield. He tried to shake them away, but sometimes they surfaced without warning. The memories were like sharp flashes of heat and dust and shouting voices. He would blink them away and return to the present, yet the weight lingered. When the long shift finally ended, Mark stepped back into the cold night. Snow had begun to fall again. His body ached in every joint, and his hands trembled slightly from fatigue. He walked home with slow, steady steps, feeling the wind push against his jacket. His mind felt weighed down by exhaustion and by the quiet pressure of memories he could not silence. But everything changed the moment he opened the door to his small room. Buddy was already awake, waiting near the entrance with ears lifted and tail moving slowly. The warm brown eyes held a gentleness that eased the heaviness inside Mark. Buddy walked toward him with careful steps, then lowered his head against Mark's leg, offering silent comfort. Mark felt a wave of warmth fill the cold space inside him. He knelt down and let his hand rest on Buddy's back, feeling the steady rise and fall of the dog's breath. Mark ate a simple meal of leftover food, sharing half of it with Buddy. The portion was small, but it was enough. Buddy ate slowly, as though understanding the need to save every bite. After they finished, Buddy settled beneath the small table in the corner where he liked to rest. Mark sat on the edge of his bed and leaned forward with his elbows on his knees, feeling the weight of the day settle across his shoulders. Later that night, when Mark finally lay down to sleep, the room grew silent once more. except for the soft sound of Buddy's breathing. Mark drifted into uneasy dreams, then awoke suddenly with a sharp gasp. His chest tightened as memories of explosions and distant cries echoed through his mind. For a moment, he felt trapped in a world he thought he had left behind. Then he felt something warm pressed gently against his leg. Buddy had crawled out from under the table and placed his head against Mark's knee, as if sensing the storm inside him. The simple gesture grounded him. Mark placed a hand on Buddy's head and breathed slowly until the nightmare faded and the room returned to stillness. Buddy stayed there watching him with calm, steady eyes. In that moment, Mark understood how much this dog meant to him. Buddy was not just a companion. Buddy was a thin, fragile thread that held him back from falling into the darkness that waited in the corners of his mind. As the days passed, their routine remained the same. Mornings at the garage, nights at the warehouse, meals shared in small portions, moments of silence broken only by Buddy's quiet breathing. Life was still difficult, and money still tight, yet something in the air of the small room had changed. There was warmth now. There was presence. There was someone waiting for him at the end of every shift. And in the quiet of the long nights, Buddy became the anchor that kept Mark from sinking deeper into the exhaustion and loneliness that once surrounded him. Through every whisper of doubt and every shadow from the past, Buddy remained at his side, a steady and loyal presence, who reminded him that even in a life filled with hardship, there could still be moments of gentle hope. The morning sky above the small Colorado town held a pale gray light as thin clouds drifted slowly across the horizon. The air was cold and still, with only a faint breeze weaving through the narrow streets and brushing against the rooftops. Snow remained on the ground in soft patches, though the sky showed no sign of new snowfall. It was a quiet and calm day, yet the silence felt weighted with something unspoken. Inside the cramped room above the old building, Mark Collins stood near the small table fastening the buttons of his worn work shirt. His movements were slow from the familiar ache in his muscles after long shifts at the garage and the warehouse. The heater hummed behind him, offering a thin line of warmth that faded before reaching the edges of the room. On the floor, near the door, Buddy lay, stretched out on his blanket. His large body relaxed, but his eyes open and steady. The German Shepherd had regained much of his strength. His coat had grown fuller, and his injured leg moved more confidently. His breathing was smooth, and even as he watched Mark with a focus that had grown sharper each day. At first, everything seemed normal. Mark tightened the laces of his boots and prepared for another long day. But when he reached for his jacket, Buddy lifted his head and stared toward the door. His ears stood up with alertness, and his gaze fixed on the wood panel, as though something waited beyond the hallway. Mark paused and looked at him with mild confusion. He expected Buddy to rise and follow him with the calm and gentle loyalty that had become routine. But Buddy remained still, except for the tension that ran through his body. The dog let out a soft, low sound deep in his throat, a sound that was not quite a growl, but carried a hint of unease. Mark approached the door, and Buddy stood up quickly, moving ahead of him. The dog pressed his nose to the bottom of the door, then lifted his head and looked back at Mark. His brown eyes were wide and intense, and they carried something that made Mark stop in place. There was no fear in them, and no confusion. Instead, there was something like urgency. Buddy turned his head toward the door again, then looked back at Mark once more. His tail remained still, his stance firm, as though waiting for Mark to follow him somewhere. Mark opened the door slowly, but the hallway outside was quiet and empty. The same old walls with peeling paint lined the narrow corridor, and nothing seemed out of place. Buddy stepped forward only a few inches, then stopped again, shifting his attention toward the north end of the hallway, where a small window overlooked the distant mountain range that stretched across the horizon. The mountains were white and cold, rising high against the sky. Buddy stared at them, as though he sensed something invisible. Mark watched the dog with a puzzled expression. He walked to the window and looked out. The view was peaceful. Snow covered the mountain peaks in soft white layers, and a faint line of morning sunlight rested on their upper slopes. Nothing seemed unusual. Still, Buddy would not look away. His ears stayed upright, and his body stiffened slightly. He let out another low sound that carried a tremble of longing or warning. Mark felt something tighten in his chest at the sight. At first he tried to dismiss it. He told himself the behavior might be the result of the dog's lingering trauma. The accident, the cold, the pain from that night might have left marks not just on the body, but on the mind. Mark returned to his room and tried to distract Buddy with a piece of leftover bread. Buddy usually accepted food eagerly, but this time he only sniffed it before turning his head back toward the mountains. The dog walked to the door again and stood there unmoving, as though insisting that Mark pay attention. When Mark moved toward the door once more, Buddy tapped his paw against the floor and looked at him with steady determination. Mark sighed softly, the sound filled with weariness, not frustration. He knelt beside Buddy and ran his hand through the thick fur along the dog's back, feeling the warmth beneath the surface. Buddy leaned into the touch, but his eyes remained fixed on the mountains. Mark whispered a calm reassurance, telling the dog that everything was fine, yet he felt uncertainty bloom inside him. Buddy's eyes told a different story. They held a quiet plea that words could not express. Over the next few days, Buddy's behavior became even more pronounced. Every morning and every evening, Buddy would position himself near the small window or the front door, staring toward the distant mountains as if someone was calling to him. When Mark prepared to leave for work, Buddy would hurry to the door and block his path for a moment. He would look at Mark, then back at the mountains, then back at Mark again. His tail remained lowered, but not tucked. His stance was firm and filled with urgency. Mark tried again to calm the dog with gentle words and small treats, but Buddy's attention would always return to the same direction. Even at night, when the room was dark and only the faint hum of the heater broke the silence, Buddy would suddenly rise from his blanket walk to the window and stare outside with the same unwavering focus. Sometimes he would let out a soft whine, a sound thin and fragile that carried a weight Mark could not ignore. Mark struggled to understand. He sat on the edge of the bed one night with his hands clasped together, feeling the concern build inside him. Buddy had saved him more times than he could count by simply being there, offering warmth and presence during the darkest hours. Now, it was Buddy who needed something. Yet Mark did not know what that something was. He wondered if the dog was remembering pain or trauma from the past. He wondered if something about the mountains stirred a memory Buddy could not voice. But each time he looked into Buddy's eyes, he saw no fear. He saw urgency. He saw a plea. He saw something that felt like a call. Mark felt drawn into the intensity of that gaze. He felt unease, but also a strange sense that the dog understood something he could not yet grasp. One morning, as Mark put on his jacket for the garage shift, Buddy ran to the door as usual. But this time, he pressed his paw against the doorframe and looked back at Mark with a deep, unwavering stare. There was no confusion, no hesitation, only purpose. Mark froze with his hand on the zipper of his jacket. The dog's eyes held him in place, and for a moment the world outside the room felt far away. The cold, the bills, the long shifts, they all faded under the weight of Buddy's silent plea. Mark knelt slowly beside him and placed a hand on Buddy's chest, feeling the steady beat of the dog's heart under his palm. Buddy did not move. He remained still as stone, except for the slight tremble of tension in his muscles. Mark whispered a quiet thought that formed before he could stop it. "Are you trying to tell me something?" The words floated into the air without sharpness or force, and Buddy responded with a faint whine, a sound filled with urgency. Mark felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air. Buddy was not afraid. Buddy was calling. And in those brown eyes, Mark saw not confusion, but a message he could not yet understand. Something waited beyond the mountains, something silent and hidden, and Buddy sensed it with a clarity that unsettled Mark to his core. The early morning sky above Colorado was pale and quiet, as thin sunlight filtered through a veil of soft clouds. The winter air carried a sharp cold that swept through the trees and brushed against the rooftops of the small town. Snow rested on the ground in firm white layers, untouched by footsteps. The wind moved gently at first, then shifted into colder waves that promised a harder day ahead. It was a still and silent Sunday morning, and for the first time in many weeks, Mark Collins did not have to report to the garage or the warehouse. Inside the small, cramped room, Mark stood near the old table and stared at Buddy, who sat beside the door, with a steady, unblinking gaze. Buddy's brown eyes held the same determined urgency that had filled them for days. The German shepherd's posture was firm and alert. His ears were lifted, and his body tense with a readiness that made Mark feel a quiet pull inside his chest. Mark had spent many nights debating within himself whether to follow Buddy's plea, and each time he hesitated. But as he looked at Buddy now, on this rare day off, he felt the decision settle inside him with a weight that felt both troubling and necessary. Mark exhaled slowly as he reached for his brown-yellow jacket. The jacket was old but thick and had followed him through many cold seasons since leaving the military. He pulled it over his shoulders and felt the familiar fabric press warmly against his skin. He put on a pair of faded blue jeans that had grown softer from years of use and slid his feet into heavy boots, whose soles had worn thin from long shifts and long walks home at night. These boots once belonged to a younger version of himself, but they still served him without fail. He filled a small cloth bag with simple items: a bottle of water, a few pieces of bread wrapped in old paper, the worn military first aid kit that had saved lives long before he carried it into civilian life. He tied the bag securely and slung it over his shoulder. Buddy moved closer, as though sensing the meaning behind every movement. His tail did not wag wildly. Instead, it moved with a slow, controlled sweep that showed steady confidence. The dog was no longer the injured creature Mark had carried through the snow weeks earlier. His coat shone despite the dim light. His body looked strong and balanced. His eyes carried purpose and focus. Mark stepped toward the door and paused for one brief moment, feeling uncertainty rise within him. He thought of the bills on his table. He thought of the night shift he would have to work soon. He thought of the money he needed more than anything. A long journey up a cold mountain made no logical sense. Yet Buddy turned back to him again, and in the dog's eyes, Mark saw something deeper than logic. He saw a call. He saw trust. He saw a quiet insistence that this journey mattered. Mark opened the door, and cold air swept into the room, wrapping around his legs like a warning and a greeting. Buddy stepped outside first, with confident strides that pressed deep into the snow. Mark followed, closing the door behind him. The chill bit into his skin immediately, but he kept moving with slow, steady steps. Buddy did not rush forward. Instead, he looked back at Mark every few minutes, as if making sure his companion was still with him. Then he continued north, toward the mountain range that stretched across the horizon. They left the town behind and walked into the forest, where tall pine trees stood like silent guardians. Snow covered every branch, forming heavy blankets of white that sagged gently under their weight. The forest air was crisp and sharp, and each breath felt like a cold wave flowing into the lungs. The ground sloped upward slowly at first, then grew steeper as they moved toward the foot of the mountains. Buddy navigated the snowy terrain with certainty. His steps were firm and sure on the icy ground. He moved ahead, but never too far, always pausing long enough to ensure Mark was still behind him. Mark trudged through the snow, feeling the strain in his legs as the path grew uneven. His breath grew heavy, and visible clouds escaped his mouth with each exhale. Mark was strong, but years of exhaustion and long shifts had worn down his stamina. The climb pressed into his knees and sent dull aches through his joints. Time passed in slow intervals. The forest grew thicker. The wind grew colder. Snow crunched beneath their feet with every step. Mark felt his breath deepen and his heartbeat pound heavily against his ribs. There were moments when he stopped and placed his hands on his knees, trying to catch his breath. A faint tremble spread through his legs. Thoughts of turning back rose sharply in his mind. He thought of the night shift he needed to prepare for. He thought of losing the little money he relied on. He thought of the risk of getting lost in the mountains. But each time he paused, Buddy turned back with bright, unwavering eyes. That look carried a plea and a determination that lifted Mark away from the thought of retreat. The dog stood still and waited with patience, but with an urgency that never faded. The sight of Buddy, standing proudly against the snowy landscape, reminded Mark of loyalty he once shared with fellow soldiers. It stirred something in his chest that carried him forward again. They moved deeper into the wilderness, crossing frozen streams where the ice glowed faintly beneath thin layers of snow. Mark stepped carefully, testing each patch of ice before placing his weight on it. Buddy crossed ahead of him with light, sure steps. They moved around fallen trees, buried halfway under snow, and climbed ridges where frosty wind pulled at their clothes and fur. The mountains towered above them, silent and unmoving, like ancient guardians, waiting for something or someone. Hours passed, and the sun began lowering behind the thick clouds, spreading muted shades of pale orange and gray across the sky. Mark's breaths grew heavier. His shoulders stiffened from the weight of the bag, and the cold air pressed against his face until his cheeks burned. His thoughts drifted to the warmth of his small room and the simple comfort of his bed. But each time Buddy stopped ahead with that same focused stare, Mark felt pulled forward by a force he could not ignore. The forest began to open slightly, and the slope leveled out. Buddy moved ahead and paused at the edge of a clearing. Mark followed, wiping sweat and cold from his forehead. His legs trembled from the long climb. His heart thudded in his chest. He looked up, breathing heavily, and saw it. In the middle of the clearing stood an old wooden cabin. It was small and worn, with walls of faded gray wood and a roof that sagged slightly under the weight of snow. The door was wrapped in heavy metal chains that crossed over the frame and locked tightly near the handle. The cabin looked abandoned. It looked like a place forgotten by time. But from the metal chimney, a thin ribbon of smoke rose slowly into the air, twisting softly in the fading light. Someone was inside. Mark stared silently, while Buddy stood beside him with a stillness that carried both tension and certainty. The long journey had led them here. The sight of the chained door and the faint smoke stirred something deep inside Mark. He felt the cold wind press against him, yet the weight of the moment burned warm in his chest. Buddy remained quiet, but his eyes shone with a fierce, unspoken urgency. Their journey had reached a point where the meaning was clear. Something waited behind that chained door, something Buddy had sensed long before Mark understood. And now, the cabin stood before them, silent and gray, with a thin lifeline of smoke rising into the cold evening sky. The late afternoon light faded slowly behind a veil of gray clouds as the cold mountain wind drifted through the clearing. Snow clung to the cabin roof in heavy white layers, and the tall pine trees surrounding the clearing stood silent and unmoving in the dim air. The temperature had dropped sharply, and each breath rose in pale mist as Mark Collins stood facing the chained wooden door. His legs ached from the long climb, and his chest still rose and fell heavily from exertion, but the urgency in front of him pushed away every thought of rest. Buddy stood beside him, with his body stiff and tense. The German shepherd's fur bristled along his spine, and a deep rumbling sound rolled from his throat. His ears were pointed straight toward the door, and his stance was firm as though he were ready to break through the wood by force. Buddy lifted one paw and struck the door with sharp, frantic scratches that echoed in the cold air. His brown eyes burned with a fierce recognition and a steady determination that made Mark feel a pulse of concern rise inside him. Mark stepped closer and placed a hand on the rusty metal chain wrapped around the cabin door. The chain was thick-heavy and cold against his skin. The padlock was old, but solid, covered in patches of rust that showed it had been there for a long time. Mark tugged at it first, with one hand, then with both, but the lock did not move an inch. He felt frustration and worry swell inside him. Something or someone was inside this cabin, and Buddy's frantic behavior made that fact impossible to ignore. Mark looked around the clearing and spotted a thick iron bar resting against the cabin's small porch railing. He walked toward it and picked it up, feeling the weight settle into his palms. The bar was cold and rough, but strong enough to serve as a lever or a striking tool. Mark returned to the door and with a deep breath lifted the bar above the lock. He swung it down hard. The impact sent a shock through his arms. Rust cracked and scraped across metal, but the lock held. Buddy growled louder and pressed against the door with his shoulder. Mark struck again and again until the skin on his hands burned with pain. Sweat mixed with the cold air and slid down his temple. Memories of forced entry drills from his service days flickered through his mind, and he tightened his grip and swung the bar with focused strength. The sound of metal giving way rang through the clearing. He struck again, pushing himself past the ache in his muscles, until finally the chain split open with a sharp metallic snap. and the lock fell into the snow. Buddy lunged forward, but Mark steadied himself and pushed the door open first. A wave of stale, heavy air flowed out, carrying the thick scent of damp wood old medicine and something sour that came from hunger and neglect. The darkness inside made it difficult to see at first. Mark stepped forward slowly, letting his eyes adjust to the dim light filtering through the cracked window. The sight before him made his chest tighten. In the corner of the cabin stood a narrow iron bed frame, and on it lay a frail elderly woman, whose body looked almost weightless beneath the thin blanket. Her hair was thin and gray, tangled across the pillow. Her skin was pale and almost translucent, stretched tightly over her cheekbones. Her lips were cracked and dry, and each shallow breath seemed to take great effort. One of her ankles was shackled to the bed frame by a metal cuff attached to a short chain. The skin beneath the cuff was raw and bruised. Mark approached slowly, aware of how fragile she appeared. Her eyes fluttered open as he stepped closer. They were of faded blue, with a distant, cloudy look, yet they carried a spark that showed she was still aware of the world around her. She tried to speak, but her throat made only a faint rasping sound. Mark leaned slightly closer, so his voice could reach her with calm and steady warmth. He asked nothing. He simply spoke softly, reassuring her that she was safe now. She swallowed with difficulty, then finally managed to push out a faint whisper. Her voice was thin, shaky, and filled with exhaustion as she said her name was Evelyn. Buddy moved to her side and gently placed his head near her arm. Evelyn turned her eyes toward the dog, and a fragile recognition spread across her tired face. Her lips trembled as she tried to speak again. She reached a shaking hand toward Buddy, and the dog pressed closer with gentle patience. Evelyn touched his fur with slow, weak movements. Her voice broke as she whispered that the dog had once belonged to her. She described how he had been beaten and driven into the forest, left to die, when he tried to protect her. The words came in fragments, each breath threatening to fail her, yet the truth was clear. Mark felt a wave of sorrow and anger rise in his chest, but he held his expression steady for her sake. He understood now why Buddy had been so desperate to return here, and why his eyes carried a depth of hurt and urgency Mark could never have guessed. Evelyn forced out another breath and said that her own grandson had locked her here to force her to hand over important land papers. Her voice grew softer with each word until the strain became too much and she could no longer speak. Buddy nudged her hand gently and remained by her side with quiet devotion. The dog's eyes softened, and he lay his head close to her arm, as though trying to shield her from the cold that hung in the cabin. Mark knelt beside the bed and examined the shackle with steady hands. The metal was old and rusted, yet strong enough to confine someone too weak to resist. The sight stirred something deep within him. The helplessness etched into Evelyn's features, and the loyalty shining in Buddy's eyes merged into a single heavy truth. Evelyn had been a prisoner. Buddy had survived a cruelty meant to silence him. And now, after a long, painful path, they had found each other again. Snow swirled outside the cabin as the wind pushed across the clearing in sharp, icy gusts. The sky carried a dull, heavy gray as late afternoon faded toward evening, and the cold grew deeper by the minute. The old wooden cabin creaked softly under the weight of the weather, and the weak light inside created long, shaky shadows along the walls. Mark Collins knelt beside the frail figure of Evelyn and tried to warm her with the thin blanket he had found in the corner. Her breaths were shallow and uneven. Her lips trembled each time she tried to swallow the small sips of water he helped her drink. Her skin was cold and pale, and her thin frame shivered with exhaustion. Mark felt a knot of worry tighten in his chest as he watched her eyelids flutter with fatigue. He whispered calm words to steady her nerves and his own trembling thoughts. Buddy stayed pressed against the side of the bed with his head near Evelyn's arm. His brown eyes were alert but soft as he watched every movement in the room. The German shepherd seemed to understand the fragile state she was in, and his breath moved in slow, quiet waves. Mark felt a brief moment of calm as he checked her pulse again, but that calm snapped instantly when Buddy suddenly stiffened. His ears rose sharply, and his muscles tensed so fast that Mark froze where he knelt. A deep, loud growl rolled from Buddy's throat, one that sounded nothing like the earlier worried whimpers. This was a warning growl filled with sharp instinct and danger. Before Mark could stand, Buddy barked once with a piercing clear sound that hit the air like an alarm. Mark turned toward the door, just as he heard heavy footsteps crunch into the snow outside. The cabin door swung open with a violent shove. A man in his late 20s stepped inside with a harsh expression carved across his face. His shoulders were narrow but tense, and his movements jittered with nervous energy. His unshaven jaw twitched as he scanned the room. His eyes were sharp and restless and carried the look of someone pushed deep into desperation. He wore a thick, dark jacket partly unzipped, and snow clung to his boots in uneven patches. A black backpack hung from one shoulder, and in his right hand he held a short-barrel handgun. His gaze stopped on Buddy, and shock washed across his features. His voice cracked as he muttered in disbelief, seeing the dog alive. He then turned toward Mark, and fear mixed with anger tightened his expression. Mark rose from his knees, feeling the exhaustion of the long climb press into his muscles. His breath grew heavy, but his mind sharpened with instinct. The stranger's trembling hand on the gun made the situation even more dangerous. Buddy barked again, with a fierce, sharp rhythm, and moved slightly toward the man, but Mark lifted a hand, trying to steady both the dog and his own pulse. The air inside the cabin became thick with tension as the two men stared at each other. The man's voice shook as he spoke, revealing the truth that Evelyn had whispered earlier. His debt, his panic, his belief that the papers locked away with Evelyn were his only hope. Mark saw a frantic desperation in his eyes, the same kind he had once seen in the eyes of soldiers trapped too long in fear. But this man had chosen greed. This man had chosen cruelty. The man pointed the gun at Mark, but his grip was unstable. The room felt smaller as Mark took a slow, steady breath and held his hands slightly forward. Before a word could be exchanged, Buddy lunged forward, not to attack, but to distract, drawing the man's aim just enough for tension to break loose. The man jerked back, and his elbow hit the small table beside the door. An old oil lantern sitting on the edge tipped forward. Mark saw it falling, but could not reach it in time. It struck the wooden floor with a shattering crack. The oil spilled instantly, and fire burst across the dry wood. Flames rose in bright sudden waves, climbing along the floorboards at terrifying speed. The cabin filled with thick heat as smoke began to rise in swirling dark strands. The man stumbled back in shock, and Buddy barked furiously as the flames grew brighter. Mark looked at Evelyn, who lay too weak to move. Her eyes opened, but fear clouded her fading strength. Mark felt the weight of the decision settle with crushing force. He could not stay to subdue the armed man. He could not leave Evelyn in the fire. His duty was clear. Mark rushed to the bed and lifted Evelyn into his arms. She felt impossibly light in his grasp. Her head pressed weakly against his shoulder as he held her close and turned toward the door. Flames licked up along the walls and smoke burned his throat. Buddy moved in front of him, barking at the man with unbroken intensity. The man tried to push forward, but Buddy lunged low and fast, slamming his weight into the man's legs. Shock overtook the intruder, and he stumbled. The uneven floor caught his feet, and he fell hard. A piece of burning wood dropped from the ceiling, sending him scrambling backward into deeper smoke. Buddy positioned himself between the man and the door as the fire spread across the room. Mark pushed forward through the rising heat, holding Evelyn tightly. Smoke gathered fast and stung his eyes and lungs. His boots struck the ground with heavy thuds as he charged toward the doorway. Buddy ran beside him, barking sharply at the flames and at the man trapped behind them. Mark burst out into the freezing air of the clearing with Evelyn in his arms. Snow crunched beneath his feet, and the cold hit his skin like a blade, but he kept running until he reached a safe distance. Buddy followed seconds later, bursting from the doorway before the flames swallowed the entrance. The dog skidded into the snow and turned toward the cabin, barking in a frantic rhythm. Behind him, the man's silhouette staggered inside, a moment too late reaching for freedom in the rising blaze. The flames roared through the old cabin walls and engulfed the doorway, trapping him inside for long enough to give Mark and Evelyn the time they needed. Mark knelt in the snow, with Evelyn still pressed against him. His breath came heavy, but relief washed through him as Buddy pressed close, leaning his warm body against Mark's side. Snowflakes drifted down silently, and the cabin burned behind them in bright, twisting flames, sending sparks into the darkening sky. They had survived the fire. They had reached the cold safety of the open snow. And for the first time since the long climb began, Mark felt the faint, trembling rise of hope. The morning sky over Colorado was a pale silver as thin, winter sunlight filtered through long strips of cloud. A cold wind traveled across the parking lot outside the hospital, turning every breath into a faint trail of mist. Snow lay along the edges of the road in uneven mounds, pushed aside by plows during the night. It was a quiet day, marked by the gentle hum of engines and the distant echo of passing cars. Mark Collins parked his old pickup truck near the entrance and turned off the engine. The truck shuddered once, then settled into silence. Buddy sat in the passenger seat, his strong frame steady, and his brown eyes fixed on the hospital doors, as if waiting for them to open and reveal the person he had brought down from the mountains. Mark rested both hands on the steering wheel and exhaled slowly. His muscles still carried the soreness from the climb, the fire, and the long, restless hours that followed. The past days had blurred into long drives between the garage where he worked, the hospital where Evelyn fought her way back to life, and his cramped rented room where he barely slept. His mind stayed alert through exhaustion, driven by responsibility and by a feeling he could not yet name. Buddy shifted beside him, releasing a soft breath, and Mark reached over to rest his hand gently on the dog's head. The warm fur beneath his palm grounded him in a way few things ever had. Mark stepped out of the truck, and Buddy followed close at his heel, walking with calm, focused steps. The automatic doors opened with a soft sigh, and warm air rushed out, carrying the sterile scent of disinfectant. Mark walked through the familiar corridor. The walls were painted a soft beige, and the lights above hummed faintly. Nurses moved quietly from room to room, each carrying a calm efficiency. Mark greeted one of them, a middle-aged woman with clear, warm eyes and dark hair tied neatly back. She nodded kindly, recognizing him from his many visits. Her voice was gentle and calm as she told him Evelyn was awake and stronger today. Mark entered the room, and the steady beeping of medical monitors filled the air. Evelyn lay propped against a thin pillow, her frail frame wrapped in a light blanket. Her face still carried deep lines from fatigue, but color had begun to return to her cheeks. Her gray hair had been brushed neatly by one of the nurses, and her eyes, though tired, lifted with a soft glow when she saw Buddy and Mark enter. Buddy walked to her bedside and lowered his head near her arm. Evelyn raised a trembling hand and brushed her fingers gently along his fur, with a tender familiarity that reached deeper than words. Mark pulled a chair close to the bed and sat down. For a moment, he simply watched her breathe, feeling a quiet relief settle inside him. The memory of finding her, chained in the cabin, and the fear in her fading gaze returned to him with sharp clarity. Now she sat alive, recovering, and able to speak. That alone felt like a miracle. Evelyn took a sip of water and steadied herself. Her voice was faint, but clearer than the day before as she began to speak. She told Mark that the rescue teams had found them because the fire lit up the forest, like a torch guiding them through the storm. They had taken her to the hospital, and the police had taken her grandson into custody. Her expression shifted with a mixture of sorrow and resignation. She explained that the boy had fallen into deep debt and lost himself to panic and greed. It did not excuse his actions, but she could not pretend she had not seen signs of his desperation long before the cruelty began. As her voice steadied, she told Mark about the land around the cabin. She explained that beneath the snowy ground lay a vein of rare gemstones identified years ago by a survey team. The land had belonged to her family for generations. When she was younger, she agreed to share ownership with a close friend, a man who had served with her in the same region and era that Mark had once fought in. The friend had no surviving family, so he left his share to the person he trusted most in the world, a soldier from his own unit who had stood with him during hard years. That soldier was Mark. Mark stared at her in stunned silence. He leaned back slightly in the chair, feeling the weight of the revelation settle on his shoulders. Evelyn reached for a brown folder placed on the bedside table by her lawyer earlier that morning. Her hands shook slightly as she passed it to him. Inside were documents, old, but official. The writing was neat. The names were clear. A signature he remembered from long ago stood printed across the top of one page. His friend had left instructions that Mark would inherit his share if anything happened to him. Evelyn explained that she had spent years trying to locate the name in the paperwork, but each attempt ended in failure. She had never imagined the man mentioned in those documents would be the same exhausted veteran who carried her out of a burning cabin. Buddy moved closer to Mark and pressed his head against the man's knee as though sensing the shift inside Mark's heart. His warm presence steadied Mark's swirling thoughts. Mark looked down at the papers again and felt a strange mixture of disbelief and responsibility growing inside him. He thought of the hard years of work, the nights spent loading trucks, the mornings spent repairing engines, and the growing pile of unpaid bills that lingered at the back of his mind like shadows he could never outrun. He had never imagined a path out of his struggle. He had only learned to endure it. Now the truth sat in his hands like a quiet key to a future he had not dared to consider. The land was valuable, the gemstones beneath it even more so. But what weighed heavier than ownership or money was the connection that tied it all together. A friend who had trusted him, a woman who had survived unthinkable cruelty, and a dog who had crossed a mountain to bring them back to each other. Evelyn watched him with gentle eyes. Her voice soft and steady, she told him she believed this was meant to be. She believed that Buddy had found him for a reason. Mark felt his throat tighten, and he lowered his gaze out of habit, a habit carried from long years of carrying burdens alone. But Buddy pressed his head harder against Mark's leg, and Mark let out a slow tremble of breath. For the first time in years, he felt something shift inside him. A sense of belonging, a sense of direction, a sense that maybe he was not alone under the weight of the world. The morning sun rose gently above the snow-capped mountains, casting a soft golden glow over the quiet valley. The winter air was crisp, but not harsh, and the breeze carried the faint smell of pine trees and clean earth. Thin clouds drifted slowly across the sky, leaving streaks of white against the pale blue. The day felt calm and hopeful, as though the land itself sensed that something long buried had begun to heal. Mark Collins stepped outside the rebuilt cabin and watched the light stretch across the hills. He wore his familiar brown-yellow jacket and faded blue jeans that had followed him through the hardest years of his life. His breath rose in small clouds as he looked at the wooden porch, newly repaired, and the smoke coming from the chimney above. This place felt different now. It felt like home. Buddy trotted toward him across the yard, with his strong legs moving confidently over the snow-dusted ground. The German shepherd's coat shone in the sunlight, and his eyes carried a proud alertness as he scanned the small property. Behind Buddy, the new wooden shelter stood near the tree line. It was simple but sturdy, with fresh planks and warm bedding inside. Several rescued dogs rested there, each with gentle eyes and timid movements. Buddy walked among them with the calm posture of an older brother who watched over the others. His presence kept them steady and safe. Evelyn stood near the porch railing, wrapped in a thick shawl over her small frame. Her gray hair was brushed neatly, and her cheeks held a soft glow that had not been there in the hospital weeks earlier. Her steps were slow but steady. She moved with a quiet grace shaped by age and hardship. Her voice, whenever she spoke, carried the warmth of someone who had found peace after too many years of fear. Mark watched her for a moment, feeling a gentle wave of gratitude settle in his chest. The legal process had been long and exhausting, but in the end, the land rights were confirmed and the documents validated. The gemstone vein beneath the soil became the key to a future Mark had never imagined possible. The income from leasing the mining rights far exceeded anything he'd made from the garage or the warehouse. He no longer feared overdue rent. He no longer measured his meals by the few dollars left in his pocket. Instead, he felt the quiet weight of stability for the first time since leaving the service. Yet Mark did not leave Colorado. He did not move to a bigger town or pursue a different life. Instead, he stayed at the foot of the mountains and chose to build a place shaped not by wealth, but by purpose. He and Evelyn repaired the old cabin together. They replaced the broken boards and patched the roof. They built a new stone hearth and sanded the wooden floor until it gleamed softly in the warm light. The cabin that once held pain and silence now held warmth, laughter, and shared dinners that carried the scent of fresh herbs and old recipes Evelyn remembered from her youth. Buddy followed Mark almost everywhere. The dog walked with a dignified calm and carried himself like a guardian of the mountain home. Mark built the small rescue shelter after seeing how Buddy offered comfort to every abandoned dog he encountered. With the money from the land, he made sure the shelter had food blankets and a warm, safe place for any dog that needed it. Buddy stayed near them throughout the day, guiding the younger, frightened dogs with gentle nudges and steady eyes. Mark also opened a small repair shop near the base of the mountain road. The shop had a simple sign and smelled of engine oil, metal, and fresh coffee. Mark spent his mornings repairing trucks and old farm vehicles. When veterans or struggling families came through his door, he often charged nothing at all. Helping them eased something inside him. It mended a part of him that war and poverty had once torn apart. A portion of his income and part of the land payments went straight to local animal rescue funds. He gave freely and without hesitation because he understood what it meant to be found when you felt invisible. As weeks passed, the cabin became more than a shelter. It became a gathering place for stories. Evelyn would sit on the porch during the evenings when the sky turned orange and purple. She would share memories of her youth, her family, and the friends she had lost in service. Her voice carried love and sorrow and a softness shaped by years of endurance. Mark listened quietly, often sitting beside her with Buddy lying across his feet. The glow of sunset brushed the mountains in warm colors, and the air around them felt full of peace. Mark found himself growing steadier with each passing day. He no longer woke each night, drowning in memories from the battlefield. Instead, he opened his eyes to the sound of fire crackling in the hearth or the soft breathing of Buddy at the foot of his bed. He realized how much his life had changed since the night he found Buddy on the snowy roadside. That one quiet decision had led him away from loneliness and into a future he never imagined. Buddy had carried him through fear and fire, through mountains and loss, and now into a life filled with purpose and companionship. Mark sat with Evelyn on the porch one evening as the breeze rustled through the pine branches. Buddy rested his head on Mark's leg and breathed slowly with peaceful weight. The moon rose high, casting soft silver light across the cabin walls. Mark looked at the two of them, the fragile woman he had saved, and the loyal dog who had saved him. His chest felt full with something warm and steady. He understood now that Buddy had not only led him to Evelyn, Buddy had led him to a new beginning, a home, a place where love anchored him more deeply than anything he had known since leaving the military. A place where he could breathe again without fear. A place to live, not just survive. In the quiet glow of the rebuilt cabin, the story of Mark, Evelyn, and Buddy settled into something larger than a rescue or a stroke of luck. It became a reminder that even in seasons of hardship, hope can arrive in unexpected forms. A lost dog on a winter road, a stranger who chooses compassion over fear, a fragile voice rising again after years of silence. These small threads wove together into a new beginning and showed that community faith and simple acts of kindness can still move mountains. Many people walk through life carrying burdens too heavy to name, yet the light can return through one caring hand or one loyal companion. Mark learned that love does not arrive loudly. It arrives quietly and stays faithfully. At the end of this journey, may you feel the gentle presence of grace in your own life. May the blessings of the Lord guide your steps, protect your family, and calm your heart through every storm. If this story has touched you, please share it with someone who may need hope today. Leave a comment to tell us where you are watching from, and consider subscribing to join our growing community. May peace and kindness follow you wherever you go.